Welcome to the March Tocqueville event on this beautiful spring day. My name is Brent Nelson, and I am the director of the Tocqueville Center for the Study of Democracy and Society and a member of the Department of Politics and International Affairs. I hope you received a brochure at the door. It contains a schedule of topics and speakers for the year. Of course, most of them have already been here, but we still have more ahead. It also contains a QR code and website information that will allow you to sign up for our announcements and donate to our work. If you look at April's event, you will see that we don't shy away from controversial topics. We will examine populism in America with three of the most prominent scholars on the subject in the world. I'm sure you will want to attend those CLPs, one of which will be co-sponsored by On Discourse. So you get to talk amongst yourselves for that one. For those of you not familiar with the Tocqueville Center, we ask the big questions at the heart of political, economic, and social life in America. Prominent scholars and public intellectuals help us explore these questions in this lecture series. But we also have a group of students called the Tocqueville Fellows who commit to spending much of their valuable free time reading and discussing important texts, interacting more deeply with invited speakers, and providing logistical help for our public events like this one. They are rewarded for their efforts at the end of the year with an off-campus retreat, which will occur this weekend. On Friday, the fellows will drive up to the Crown Plaza in Asheville, North Carolina, to spend 3 days discussing Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America with Tocqueville scholar and Furman grad, Professor Raul Rodriguez of the University of Texas at Austin. Now, why am I telling you this? Because if you are a student, I would like for you to consider applying. Come on. There we go. Applying for next year's Fellows Program. It is open to students of all majors who wish to go deeper in their search for truth. Applications for next year are available now, and all you have to do is shoot the QR code, and you'll get there. As many of you know, the Tocqueville Center has received a $1 million gift to endow the Tocqueville Fellows Program. This extraordinary gift will allow us to continue building the best program of its kind anywhere in the United States. We are looking forward to bringing our big dreams to fruition for our students. However, it will take more resources than even $1 million. If you happen to have another $1 million lying around, consider using the QR code you find in your brochure. So thank you. Okay, to the task at hand. As I mentioned before, Alexis de Tocqueville, a young French aristocrat, was interested in everything American when he toured the United States in 1831. His famous book, Democracy in America, offered insights that still resonate today. In fact, if you have a brochure, open to today's event and read the quotations from the second volume of Tocqueville's great work. He does some comparative analysis, positing America as a society valuing the freedom and common sense of ordinary people, and Russia as a society valuing one-man rule and servitude as the principal means of social action. But then he goes on to predict in 1835 that the United States and Russia are destined to control the destinies of half of the world, implying a competition for global control. Frankly, that may have been more true during the Cold War, but don't tell Vladimir Putin that right now. Tonight we will focus on America's relations with Russia in the 20th and 21st centuries. Tomorrow night we will expand our scope to include China as this global dance of nuclear powers continues. And I might say, in our panel discussion today, we will also be bringing in China. Before I introduce our speaker, let me tell you how we will proceed. First, Professor Radchenko will speak, Then we will bring up a response panel, including Susan Shirk and Mike Bressler, to discuss Sergey's talk. And finally, we will open questions from the floor. So store up your questions for the Q&A. Now to our speaker. You can get the long biography in the brochure, but Sergey Radchenko is the Wilson E. Schmidt Distinguished Professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Professor Radchenko is a native of Sakhalin Island, Russia, and was educated in the US, Hong Kong, and the UK, where he received his PhD at the London School of Economics. Before he joined SAIS, he worked and lived in Mongolia, China, and Wales, which is a long ways from China. Professor Radchenko's books include Two Suns in the Heavens, The Sino-Soviet Struggle for Supremacy, and Unwanted Visionaries, The Soviet Failure in Asia and the End of the Cold War. His most recent book is To Run the World, the Kremlin's Cold War Bid for Global Power. Just last week, we received word that To Run the World has been awarded this year's prestigious Lionel Gelbard Prize for the world's best nonfiction book on foreign affairs in English. Coincidentally, it is a prize that Susan Shirk, whom you will meet shortly, has also won for her most recent book. So, now Professor Radchenko to speak to the topic, the Russia problem with an eye to China. Dr. Radchenko.
Thank you, Dr. Nelson. It is such a great pleasure to be here, great honor. So thank you all for coming today to listen to a talk by somebody raised in South Sakhalin Island for the first time in South Carolina. Very different places, I have to say, very different places, but I'm sure there's some similarities. So I'm a historian, and as Dr. Nelson has just mentioned, I did write this book that looks at Russia historically, particularly through the period of the Cold War. And so in my remarks today, I will try to focus more on history, but also drawing connections to the present, because I think we are rooted in the past in many ways, and many things that happen today you can find echoes of this, or rather you can find echoes of what happened in history today, and nowhere is this more obvious than in the case of Russia. Where I would like to begin is a moment in May 1988 when President Ronald Reagan visited Moscow. He traveled to Moscow to meet Mikhail Gorbachev, who was then the General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party. They toured the Kremlin, and then something unusual happened. I don't know if any of you have been to Moscow, but so you've got the Kremlin, which is well guarded. You can hang out inside. But then there's also the Red Square. Anybody can go there. And so they went out through the gates into the Red Square quite unexpectedly, without much of a preparation or security or anything like that. They walked about and talked to the locals, talk to children, etc. Asked them how they were. It was a very strange experience. And later, Reagan was asked in a press conference whether he still thought, after that experience, whether he still thought that the Soviet Union was an evil empire. No, he answered. It was another time, another era, referring to his earlier remarks some years before about the Soviet Union being an evil empire. And that was strange at a certain level. It was strange because the Soviet Union in 1988 was still a sprawling superpower with an empire stretching across Eastern Europe and hundreds of thousands of troops. For example, in East Germany, thousands of nuclear weapons. It was also a global empire with clients from Angola to Cuba to Vietnam to Mongolia. and a whole army in Afghanistan that was still fighting a brutal war. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, would not withdraw until February 1989. I mean, they were on the way out, but they were still in Afghanistan. Old European cities like Kiev, Minsk, Riga, Tallinn, Vilnius were under Moscow's control. And yet, some months earlier, the United States and the Soviet Union signed a breakthrough nuclear treaty eliminating a whole class of missiles, the intermediate range ballistic, or the INF, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which is now may it rest in peace, and is now dead some years ago, died a sad death. But they signed it in 1987. Earlier yet, in October 1986, in Reykjavik, Presidents Gorbachev and Reagan broached the possibility of eliminating nuclear weapons entirely. It was actually a very strange episode. Reagan was a little bit confused about what was going on. They were having this discussion about nuclear weapons, and Reagan just said, "Why don't we just get rid of all nuclear weapons?" And Gorbachev said, "Yeah, why don't we do that?" But it never got to that point. But it was broached there. Unthinkable, right? Unthinkable leaders of two superpowers. One of them still really spread out across Eurasia. Consider their circumstances. Just a few years earlier, relations between Moscow and Washington were, in fact, very tense. Martial law had been imposed in Poland. The Soviets had invaded Afghanistan. On September 1st, 1983, the Soviets shot down a civilian airliner that was flying from Alaska to South Korea, with the death of 246 passengers and 23 crew, including a sitting U.S. Congressman, Larry McDonald, from the state of Georgia. It was the one thing that Sakhalin was actually quite well known for. That's the place where I grew up. The plane was flying over Sakhalin when it was shot down. I should also say that the Soviets also inadvertently killed a sitting U.S. senator and a presidential hopeful, Harry Scoop Jackson, who had a heart attack just hours after he held a press conference condemning the shoot down. Anyway, the superpower tensions ran so high in 1983 that historians have taken to calling this period the Second Cold War. We don't do that anymore, because now when we talk about the Second Cold War, now we're talking about a potential Cold War between the United States and China. But back when, people talked about the early 80s as potentially, or as the Second Cold War. And yet, just a few years later, here was President Ronald Reagan chatting away happily with President Mikhail Gorbachev right there in the Red Square. The same Reagan who had called the Soviet Union an evil empire and promised to send it to the dustbin of history. But it was, as he said, another time, another era. But even if President Reagan accepted the Soviet no longer evil empire as America's partner in a new post-Cold War world, tectonic shifts were already underway, nowhere more so than in Eastern Europe, clamoring for freedom from Soviet domination. It is easy to understand the position of those Eastern European countries. Here was Europe nearby, prosperous, alluring, and here was the Soviet Union, basically broken state, backward empire that momentarily relaxed its grip. Little wonder that they bolted. The Soviets did not intervene. They could not afford to, as Gorbachev put it when discussing the prospect of such intervention. Intervene, and then what? Who will pay for them? The Soviets could not afford an empire in Eastern Europe. And Gorbachev understood that, and that's why he ultimately, well, it's not the only reason why he ultimately decided not to do anything about it, but it was one of the reasons. Then the Soviet Union itself began to fall apart. I remember that promise very well because I was living in Sakhalin Island at that time and experienced the wonders of late socialism, which included, as I tell my students, say, you know what, how America won the Cold War? it was all about toilet paper, as far as I'm concerned. I'll tell you why. Because we didn't have toilet paper. We did not have. We used newspapers. We'd cut it up and have little pieces of paper. That's not obviously one example. Nothing worked. Nothing worked. Things were falling apart. The Soviet Union had not delivered on the promise of material prosperity. This is what they had promised the people, that we would live wonderfully in communism, but instead what we had is a deficit economy. Stuff wasn't working. Stuff was just missing from shops. You'd have to stand in line waiting for, for your new shoes or something, whatever you wanted to buy. I remember the last time I went to a communist demonstration. And we used to have those all the time in November. Every November there would be an anniversary of the communist revolution. So you'd go there and you'd parade. You'd have a parade. And so you'd march in a parade. And I remember my last one. I never made it because one of the shops on the way suddenly had sausages, and you could see that. And so I ended up standing with my parents in line for sausages. And so that was the end of that. So yeah, they had failed to deliver on material prosperity. But above all, Gorbachev loosened the screws of political control, permitting freedom, unmitigated, unconstrained, raw, destructive freedom of the kind that you can only have in a place that had never experienced anything of the kind. And so the Soviet Union deconstructed rapidly and decisively, or it was deconstructed by firebrand populists and prophets of national liberation, who were drawn on the broad support of the electrified electorate. It was a miracle that all of that happened peacefully. Not all of it, true. There was bloodshed in Georgia and Tajikistan, which experienced civil wars that people did not really talk about. Moldova, and also ethnic cleansing between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Some of these conflicts continue to fester today, but by and large, it was a peaceful breakup, almost too peaceful. The worst was yet to come. Many were worried about the Soviet breakup. Among those worried the most was President George H.W. Bush, who said in his famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, remarks in Kiev on August 1st, 1991, that, and I quote, "Freedom is not the same as independence. Americans will not support those who seek independence in order to replace a far-off tyranny with a local despotism. They will not aid those who promote a suicidal nationalism based upon ethnic hatred." This is a very famous speech that President Bush made. It was called the Chicken Kiev speech. It was later criticized for that because he failed to appreciate Ukrainian striving for independence. Who else was worried about the Soviet breakup? You'd be surprised. The Chinese were very worried about it. The Chinese ambassador in Moscow met with the not very impressive cast of characters who tried to organize a coup d'etat in August 1991. He was, I think, the only foreign ambassador who did so. Nobody wanted to touch those guys. They were not very impressive. But the Chinese ambassador went there, and we don't know what they talked about, and the ambassador was quickly recalled once the coup failed. But the Chinese still, in their conversations with the Russians, or the Soviets at that time, they were basically telling them, look, we support the Soviet Union, we want you to survive. And it's no wonder, in a sense, actually, I think it is interesting. It is strange, because for many years, the Soviet Union was China's number one enemy. In 1969, they basically went to war. There was an undeclared war that was fought out on this little island on the Ussuri River that separates China and Russia. Today, it's long become part of China, that little island. But they fought a border war, and the Soviet Union were at that time they were making threats of a nuclear strike against China. Not direct, but sort of indirect. By the way, if you keep doing this, we'll nuke you, kind of language. So the Chinese had a reason to be worried about the Soviet Union, and yet, despite for years calling Moscow an imperialist country, or social imperialist country, as they call them, now they saw Soviet survival as indispensable to China's own well-being, for if the Soviet Union fell, so could China. What really was the difference between them? They were both empires rather than nation states, and both had problems with nationalism. The Chinese were worried that having defeated superpower peer, the United States would turn on China. For all those reasons, keeping the Soviets alive and strong served China's national interests. The Chinese did not like President Boris Yeltsin. That's obviously after the Soviet collapse, Boris Yeltsin became Russian president, but they gradually warmed up to him, partly because Yeltsin, far from being a radical prophet of democracy, which could have entailed in his case such steps as recognizing Taiwan's independence, some of the people in his circle actually actively advised him to. So why don't you recognize Taiwan? They're democratic, you should do that. Yeltsin did not do that. He instead embraced China pragmatically. The Chinese reciprocated. The Sino-Soviet rapprochement had in fact occurred earlier in the 1980s. The basis for this rapprochement was Moscow's willingness to recognize Beijing's equality. So before I go into this, and I think that's very relevant for what we're discussing today, let me back up a bit and discuss the history of Sino-Russian relations. I won't spend too much time. That history goes back to the 17th century, but I will not go that far back in time. I'll go back in time to the 1950s. In 1950, China and the Soviet Union signed an alliance. It was a communist alliance that was supposed to be eternal and unbreakable, but it proved very fragile in the end. Put simply, the Chinese were unable or unwilling to be the underdog in this relationship. The nature of the dispute was exposed powerfully in the summer of 1958 when the Chinese and the Soviets quarreled for the first time over the so-called joint fleet proposal. What happened there was basically the Soviets were telling the Chinese, let's build a joint fleet. As kind of a submarine fleet is what they were talking about. And the Chinese were not happy about this. And you think, well, why is that? That's because they felt that this would impinge on Chinese sovereignty. The Soviets were allowing themselves too much. How can you even propose something like that? That's outrageous. You're basically taking away our sovereignty. And so on July 21st, 1958, Mao Zedong called in the Soviet ambassador, Pavel Yudin, for a dressing down. It was a really remarkable moment in Sino-Soviet relations. What did he tell the ambassador? He said, you don't, and I quote, you don't trust the Chinese. You only trust the Russians. The Russians to you are superior, while the Chinese are inferior, clumsy. Hence the question of joint operation. Speaking of that, how about putting everything under joint operation? The Army, Navy, and Air Force, industry, agriculture, culture, and education? Shall we hand over to you our coastline of over 10,000 kilometers while we ourselves engage solely in organizing guerrilla forces? This was a really powerful presentation on the part of the Chinese leader. The Soviet ambassador basically panicked, came back to Moscow, said something is going on. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev immediately flew to China and met with Mao Zedong in Beijing. It was a very famous meeting. It took place inside a swimming pool, if you can imagine that. And Mao Zedong, after Khrushchev said, "Oh, you don't." Our ambassador did not understand his instructions. That's what happened. Mao Zedong said, "Oh, okay. So it's fine." But it was never fine. It was never fine again. And already it was clear by the late 1950s that the Sino-Soviet alliance was rapidly falling apart. Now, a lot of people have worked on this question of what actually drove them apart, why they had this massive quarrel which led in a short period of time to basically a military confrontation, could have ended up in a nuclear war. It's a very interesting question. Now, if we turn to Khrushchev and ask the Soviet leader, well, he's dead now, but if we look at his documents and try to find out what he thought about that, it's actually interesting. In the spring of 1963, he explained it to Fidel Castro. Remember Fidel Castro of Cuban fame? He turned up in Moscow after the Cuban Missile Crisis. By the way, he was not happy with Khrushchev. He thought that Khrushchev sold him out in Cuba, because remember, he withdrew from Cuba. We had the Cuban Missile Crisis. Khrushchev backed out, and Castro was not happy about it. And Khrushchev kept inviting him. Well, why don't you come to Moscow? We'll have a good conversation. So ultimately, Castro came to Moscow, got some aid from Khrushchev, which was very helpful. But then asked him, what's the problem between you and the Chinese? What is the difference between you? Why are you having this quarrel? And Khrushchev told him, that's exactly what I'm asking. What are the differences? And then he went on. It's a question of nationalism, a question of egoism. This is the main thing. They want to play the first fiddle. But this is not decided by vote. This is determined by one's status and by the other's recognition. Even among friends, 5-10 people are friends, and one of them is the leader. They don't elect him, they just recognize him for certain qualities. This is how it is and how it will be in the future. People won't all be black or red-haired. There will be different colors and different temperaments and different mental capabilities among people. There will be inequality like elsewhere in nature. And what do you even call this? Right? He's being asked, why is it that we have this? Well, it's because the Chinese want to take our place. They want to be number one, but we are it. We're just better. That's why we're better. We deserve it because, we defeated Nazi Germany and we sent the Sputnik into space in 1957. And what did the Chinese do? They did not even send, in Mao Zedong, that's Mao Zedong's own words, they did not even send half a Sputnik into space. So of course, the Soviet, the Chinese did not deserve to lead, but of course the Chinese tried to compete. They tried to compete, and what was Mao's criminal Great Leap Forward, which you would have heard of, that led to the death of something like 35 million people. What was that if not an effort to leapfrog the Soviet Union in economic development? Khrushchev was very skeptical about the Great Leap Forward. They wanted to show us how to build communism, he said. Well, all they got was a stink, nothing else. Well, then Khrushchev himself was overthrown. That's how things happen in Russia. You have this guy who seems to be forever, and then suddenly his colleagues gang up on him and get rid of him. And this is what happened to Khrushchev. He was overthrown by his colleague, by his protege, actually, Leonid Brezhnev. Now, Leonid Brezhnev, when it came to China, he had an obsession. He had an obsession. He had a fear of China. He thought the Chinese, and here's some quotes for you. This is really quite striking. I don't even know what to call this, racism, perhaps. I think it's a pretty racist view, actually, on the part of Brezhnev when it came to China. He said the Chinese were characterized by brutality, perfidy, and hypocrisy. They were treacherous and spiteful, not honorable, exceptionally sly and perfidious. And Mao Zedong, Brezhnev could not even decide who he was. Was he communist or was he fascist? And then in the end, he just concluded, and as Brezhnev concluded, that Mao Zedong was just the new Chinese emperor. Anyway, it was this fear of China, a real fear of China, that drove Moscow's turn towards the United States during the period that we call the Tone, that unfolded from the late 1960s and into the early 1970s. Brezhnev loved Richard Nixon. He loved. Not. He was heartbroken, by the way, when Watergate happened. He couldn't understand. He thought he had a very conspiratorial mindset about it. He thought that Watergate happened because Nixon's enemies were determined to bring him down because of Nixon improved relations with the USSR. So that's why they went after Nixon. He thought it was the same people who, quote unquote, killed Kennedy. They also brought down Nixon, and also he thought that RFK, he claimed that the CIA killed him despite the obvious evidence that it was a Palestinian activist. But the Soviets always, and the Russians still do, they have this conspiratorial mindset about how things work or do not work in the United States. But Brezhnev loved Nixon. He was looking towards a kind of a vision where Moscow and Washington would decide the fate of the world. There was actually a really funny episode that happened in '73. Okay, here's a little story for you. In '72, Richard Nixon goes to China. He goes to this banquet and makes a toast. And obviously, they drink some Chinese liquor called Mao Tai. Makes a toast in which he says, "China and the United States hold the future of the world in their hands." And this was published because it was a public event. So this was published. Brezhnev read about it in the New York Times. Right? He didn't read the New York Times. Somebody told him. And he was outraged by this. How could they say that? Well, China and the United States are holding the future of the world in their hands. That's outrageous. And so when Kissinger turned up in Moscow, Henry Kissinger, Nixon's national security advisor, he had to explain that. He said, well, the president just had a little too much to drink. Don't pay attention. Don't pay attention. That's nothing. Anyway, so later, when Brezhnev turned up, Brezhnev came to the United States in 1973, and he had a wonderful time. By the way, we have this one document that I think tells like nothing else the personal relationship of this admiration, just the kissing up that took place between Brezhnev and Nixon. It's a one-way kissing up. Nixon, or rather, Brezhnev was kissing up to Nixon. It took place in the Oval Office, and you can just see how they. It's an audio recording. You can see how they Brezhnev, how he expressed himself, how much he admired Nixon, and they talked about their families, etc., etc. It's a really unique moment, actually, and the only reason we have the audio recording is because Nixon was tape recording the Oval Office, which brought him down in Watergate. But anyway, so as historians, we can be very glad about this kind of evidence. But anyway, after that, they went to California, where to what Brezhnev would describe as Nixon's dacha, which I guess is a house in California. And they had a dinner there, of which we only have the Russian record because it was Kissinger who took the American record. And when Kissinger was in the room, Brezhnev did not like to talk about anything important. He was suspicious that Kissinger was trying to pull the president in the wrong direction. So he thought, let's wait until Kissinger leaves and then we can talk. And so we have the Russian record of this, but not the American record. So there's this dinner, and during the dinner, Nixon makes a toast in which he says, the Soviet Union and the United States hold the destiny of the world in their hands. Hallelujah. Brezhnev wrote a report about that, sent that with a top secret classification to his Politburo colleagues. You see, they recognize this. This is so important. This is so important. And yet, despite this seeming positive relationship, this detente failed, and the two countries fell back into confrontation. Why did this happen? Mainly, I think, because they were strategic rivals. It was like two scorpions in a bottle, with global ambitions and an ability to project power globally, locked in a zero-sum game. They also had different values and different ideologies, communism versus capitalism. Did it matter? I think it mattered to some extent. It mattered because there was a certain fear that each side had about the other. The Soviets feared American subversion. They feared American ideas. The Americans feared Soviet subversion and Soviet ideas, though perhaps not to the same extent. After all, by the late 1970s, the Soviets were hardly in a position to win hearts and minds of the average man. Well, I spoke earlier about the Sino-Soviet rapprochement in the early 1980s. To understand what happened, we have to consider the circumstances. Basically, at that time, the Soviet Union felt isolated on the international stage. Poland had declared martial law, so sanctions came down against Moscow, and then they, of course, previously to that, they invaded Afghanistan, and so things were basically. The Soviets felt quite isolated from the West. On the other hand, here were the Chinese. Maybe they were not so bad after all, compared to what was happening in Soviet relations with the West. And so that certainly helped bring the two powers together. But what really mattered was that the Soviets now were willing to recognize China's equality, unlike before. Before, remember, they were not willing to do that. The Chinese were the younger brothers. Now, Chinese Deputy Prime Minister, a guy called Li Peng, who later became quite infamous for his role in the Tiananmen crackdown. He turned up in Moscow in December 1985 and said, "We're quite willing to improve relations with the Soviet Union, but as he said, I quote, China will not become the Soviet Union's younger brother." Gorbachev later recounted his response. I said, "It will just be difficult to imagine China in the role of a younger brother." And so the ground for approachment was laid. President Boris Yeltsin and Jiang Zemin took this relationship to new heights in the 1990s. Jiang Zemin would travel to Moscow. He would meet Boris Yeltsin. Boris Yeltsin, who had a health problem, he would, there was one visit that Jiang Zemin, I don't know if some of you may remember that, Jiang Zemin went to Moscow and he went to see Yeltsin in the hospital. And of course, Jiang Zemin still had some recollection of the good times of Sino-Soviet relations, and he knew some Russian, and he would sing songs in Russian, which was endeared lots of Russians to Jiang Zemin. He was very charismatic, relatively charismatic, I guess, by the average standard of Chinese leaders. There was at the same time already kind of a decline in the enthusiasm in Russia for the United States. And we're talking about the mid-1990s, right? Now, in the early 1990s, there was a great enthusiasm in Russia for the United States. America was this wonderful place out there. And I can tell you that, in a slight aside, that's how I ended up leaving Sakhalin Island. There was an opportunity for me. I was in Sakhalin Island, think about it. And there was an opportunity in the program, a scholarship program, which I could apply for. And I first arrived in the United States from Sakhalin Island. I went from Sakhalin straight to Texas, which was a real eye-opening experience. But at the same time, so at that very time, relations were already going off the rails. Partly it was about NATO enlargement. Boris Yeltsin complained about it to no end. He would tell Clinton, this is a humiliation for us. You're trying to humiliate us through NATO enlargement. Why are you doing that? And Clinton would say, well, no, we cannot just defer to Russia on this. Eastern European countries, they want to be part of NATO, so we'll have to, we're listening to them, and Russia doesn't have the right of veto. But that issue of NATO enlargement really spoiled the relationship. Now, it wasn't the only thing. There was also, there were other things like Russia invading Chechnya in 1994. How about that? That was a brutal experience. And also, by the way, one of the things that drove a lot of Eastern Europeans into saying to the Americans, look, quickly, we want to get into NATO before the Russians really come back and, eat us or conquer us again. But there was also a sense in the United States at that time that the Russians were simply unwilling to take American advice offered in good faith. It's Russia that must move toward us, toward our way of doing things, argued Bill Clinton's Russia hand Strobe Talbot. True, this sounded like American exceptionalism. Well, tough, Talbot wrote in a memorandum, which you can find now. It's been declassified. That's us. That's the US. We are exceptional. Meanwhile, Russia is either coming our way or it's not, in which case it's going to founder as the USSR did. Talbot likened America to a lighthouse that was showing the way to the, and I quote, the rickety, leaky, oversized, cannon-laden good ship Russia with its stinking bilge, its erratic, autocratic captain, and its semi-mutinous crew. Well, that sort of approach was certainly not appreciated in the Kremlin. The Chinese, by contrast, took a different line. They offered the Russians what the Russians craved so badly, a sense of equality. This became the foundation of the so-called strategic partnership between these two countries. The bottom line was clear enough even then. China needed a strong Russia because only strong Russia would counterbalance the so-called American hegemony. Here's what the Chinese ambassador Li Fengling told the Russians in August 1998. By the way, I've got some of this, I'm citing from these documents that are no longer, unfortunately, accessible, but for a time I was working in Moscow and I had access to these documents up to approximately the early 2000s. So, Chinese ambassador Li Fengling told the Russians in August 1998, "I assure you that China wants to see Russia strong. We must be together, though we're under huge pressure. We must cooperate in every sphere." That's 1998. It's really, in many ways, that reflects what the Chinese continue to tell the Russians, and even today continue to tell the Russians. The notion here, the underlying notion, is that China needed Russia because they felt that there was pressure from the United States. It was building up, and the Russians certainly had to have the same attitudes towards China. So it's certainly not about Putin and Xi Jinping, though it helps that they seem to understand one another. There is and has been a broader logic underlying Sino-Russian cooperation in the age of rapid change. Yet the Chinese today are worried. President Trump's pivot towards Russia has left the Chinese scrambling for a proper strategy to reassure their strategic partner. And I don't know if you follow that recently. They have been, of course, quite worried. Putin sent his former Minister of Defense, Shoigu, to Beijing. The guy is not even in any official role at the moment. He's just sort of an advisor of some kind. But he was received by Xi Jinping, pretty high honor. And that is because Xi Jinping wanted to reassure the Russians. We need, we respect you, we want you, etc. Of course, the Russians have been trying to do the same thing. The Russians are playing it smart. They need China. They rely on its economic power. They understand the political significance of a closer Sino-Russian alignment. It is what makes Russia such an attractive target of a quote-unquote reverse Nixon strategy that is currently being pursued by some people in the American leadership. I'm not saying that everyone thinks this way, but certainly lots of people in Washington think this way, that you can kind of drive a wedge between Russia and China, pull Russia away from China. But the Russians also understand today that Strobe Talbot's America, the one that served, or at least wanted to serve as the lighthouse for Russia and other would-be delinquents of the international order, is beginning to fade into the past. It was another time, another era. And there is now a new America in the making, one of seemingly more limited ambitions, and one whose values Putin at least superficially shares. It feels somehow less threatening and so more desirable as a partner. Will this new America overlook Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine and seek a new start with Putin? Who can tell? Reagan's rapprochement with a much bigger Soviet empire shows that Kremlin's imperialism need not be an obstacle to better relations. The prospects for such a turnaround are still uncertain. There is, after all, an active war in the heart of Europe where Russia is hard at work rebuilding its empire. But if history teaches us anything, it's that tectonic shifts can and do happen overnight, catching us all off guard. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergey. And now I would like to invite our two panelists, Susan and Mike, to come up to the stage, and I'll be introducing them. Susan Shirk is a research professor at the University of California, San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy, and director emeritus of its 21st Century China Center. She received her BA in Political Science at Mount Holyoke College, MA in Asian Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, and her PhD in Political Science from MIT. Professor Shirk is also Director Emeritus of the UC Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation. From 1997 to 2000, she served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of East Asia and Pacific Affairs, with responsibility for China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Mongolia. Professor Shirk also co-chairs the UC San Diego Forum on U.S.-China Relations, the first ongoing high-level forum focused entirely on U.S.-China relationship. Professor Shirk's many books include China, Fragile Superpower, Changing Media, Changing China, and her most recent book, Overreach, which I do have here. Actually, I also have To Run the World. You can read that tonight. It'll probably be quick reading for you. It's a weapon as well as a book door stopper. But also Overreach is right here. Overreach, the subtitle is How China Derailed Its Peaceful Rise, for which she won the Lionel Gelbert Prize in 2023. So we have two very prominent scholars here. Michael Bressler is Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Furman University. He earned his BA from The Ohio State University. Just Ohio State, okay. Since he went to Michigan after that, it cured him of all of that hoity-toity stuff, right? All right, so he got his AM and his PhD from the University of Michigan. He is the editor of and contributing author to the book Understanding Contemporary Russia. His current research is in the field of American foreign policy, examining how members of Congress have sought to influence the course and content of presidential war policy. So let's welcome our panelists. So first of all, make sure your microphones are on. There should be a green light there somewhere, or a visible light. And I'm going to ask Professor Shirk, Susan, if you would first just open with some comments about what Sergey has told us.
Certainly. Well, it's great to be here. My first visit to Furman, and I'm very grateful for the invitation. What Sergey's talk about the history of Russia-China relations was absolutely fascinating. And this has been a kind of troubled friendship for a very long time, of course, and the Russian support for the Chinese Communist Party was kind of mixed. And interesting that over the last month, when I was in China, I had an interesting conversation with a Chinese academic who said to me that he himself is a realist who sees power and security as the main drivers of international relations. But in recent years, he said he's come to see actually leadership as being much more important, and the political security, the political incentives of the leader in domestic politics. And what he suggested to me was that for all of those decades, Chinese leaders have been very insecure and felt that they would be potentially undercut or subverted by Russia. And that's why, for example, in the Cultural Revolution, the target of Mao's Cultural Revolution was Soviet revisionism, and that the officials in the Chinese Communist Party, he felt had always been too close to Russia. Going back to the days after the Great Leap Forward, the same thing with Peng Dehuai, and of course Lin Biao launch, or at least his son tries to launch a coup. He's killed going to Russia. And if you go all the way back, even of the days of the Chinese Revolution, of course, the Chinese Communist movement was divided between those who were pro-Russian and those who were more close to Mao. So Mao was suspicious of Russia. I mean, the way you described it is a closer, you're sort of accentuating the more positive side, but I think you could tell the same history with an emphasis on the suspicion that Chinese leaders had about Russia. Then, of course, we have a real um, uh, little war between China and Russia that is more about security and things than about the paranoia of the leader. But, um, you know, what's interesting, what my colleague, Chinese colleague, observed, and I guess I noticed this too, is that Xi Jinping feels that he gets more security, more support, more political support from Russia. And the subversion side that he worries about is color revolution coming from the United States and the West. And so this is a point of alignment between Xi and Putin. Xi feels more, less at risk with Putin. And of course, the story of the Xi Putin relationship is what they've met 40 some odd times. She's met with Putin more than any other leader. And we have, and even though it looks to me, and I'd really be interested in what you have to say about the friendship without limit, the statement that they signed together on the eve of the Beijing Winter Olympics, that um, uh, it looked like Putin had kind of tri- tricked Xi Jinping into endorsing his invasion of Ukraine because he did not, according to at least what most Chinese say that I've talked with, Putin did not reveal, and I think the Americans believe this too, did not reveal to Xi Jinping what his plans were in Ukraine. And so he got Xi Jinping to sort of arm in arm talk about their friendship into the future, even though, and by the way, at the exact same time, as I'm sure you know, the Americans were sharing intelligence with the Chinese, telling them that we knew about what Putin was actually planning. But Putin didn't believe us, perhaps because we're the ones he's most worried about subverting his own personal power, but chose to believe what Putin said to him. And so Putin entrapped him into standing together with the Russians as the Russians invade Ukraine. So at that point, Biden tells Xi, so, the story of this triangle is so interesting because it does get to the personalities, the leaders. And he says, you better not give Putin weapons because I'm going to impose massive sanctions on you if you do. And it appears that Putin conforms to that and doesn't provide actual weapons. But over time, he starts helping build up the military industrial complex in Russia, which infuriates the Biden administration. And they put a tremendous amount of effort into trying to persuade the Chinese to stop doing that. He said, this is a core interest for us. This is about the security of the West, the security of Europe. And yet, nothing that the United States senior officials did could persuade the Chinese, persuade Xi Jinping, I would say, into stopping their support of the military industrial complex in Russia. So, and of course, now we have this sudden turnabout in the American stance, which is very disorienting to many people in the United States, and I would say also disorienting to many people in China. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. And I'll let Mike give his response, and then Sergey, you'll have a chance to respond to all of that.
I'm not a sinologist.
No.
Well, I'll defer to Sergey. I've got some other things I would like to raise.
That's great. Oh, right now. Okay. Yeah.
No, it doesn't have to be right now.
Okay.
I thought Sergey.
Yeah. Okay,
respond
Sergey,
first.
go ahead and respond to Susan. That would be great.
So thank you, Susan, for this comments. I agree with you. From what we understand, Putin did not tell Xi Jinping about the invasion. In fact, what he did, effectively getting the outward appearance of Chinese support with that statement that was issued, is similar to what Mao Zedong did in 1958 during the Second Taiwan Straits crisis. Remember, I mentioned Khrushchev visited him and they had the swimming pool conversations. Later, just a couple of weeks later, China started bombarding Jimin Islands. They did not tell the Russians anything about this at all, which just was an outrage from the Soviet perspective because this was an alliance. This time, you don't really have an alliance between China and Russia, so that's a slightly different situation. I think, by the way, this makes the relationship today more durable, because part of the problem with the Sino-Soviet relationship was precisely this rigidity imposed on it by ideology. So, for example, when in 1959 China went to war with India, the Soviets were like, well, the Indians are our good friends, the Chinese are supposed to be our allies, we don't want to support either side, so they issued a statement of neutrality. The Chinese were outraged because they thought this was a betrayal on the part of the Soviets. Today, if, let's say, China goes to war with India, God save us from this, the Russians will be happily standing aside and saying, look, we're neutral in this, and the Chinese will have to accept that. So it's a different relationship today. I agree with you that this personal element matters a great deal, and you see that throughout this history of the relationship between Soviet and Russian leaders and their American and Chinese counterparts, how individuals changed the course of history. Mao Zedong clearly created the Sino-Soviet split. Now, you might argue that the Soviet attitude is what made it possible because they were so arrogant and so imperialistic. But Mao, he was just full of resentment for this, and he drove that relationship towards a break. I think he was personally just really hated to be in this kind of position. And one thing that I have been trying to understand is how much ideology ultimately mattered to him, or how much it was a question of, real politic interests and realignment of China because of security concerns and so on. Some Chinese historians and some Western historians of China argue that, for example, Mao was driven by ideology, but then you see this remarkable turnaround in the late 60s, early 70s, or 71, 72 towards the United States, which the Chinese have been condemning as this, imperialist enemy number one, and suddenly the turnaround. It was actually, well, I won't go into this story, although I could tell the story. There was this remarkable moment in 1970, I think, in the fall of 1970, when Edgar Snow turned up in China. Remember Edgar Snow, who rode the Red Star over China? Went to see Mao Zedong, and Mao Zedong told him, because Mao Zedong thought that Edgar Snow was a CIA spy, but he wasn't. He was a leftist journalist.
Yeah.
Was well known, but Mao didn't know that. So he said, when you see Richard Nixon, tell him that I told him that Richard Nixon is the number one good fellow in the world. And
I
Edgar
don't
Snow's
think
like,
Snow would
what,
like that.
what? What'd you say? And Mao Zedong repeated, tell him that I thought that he was number one fellow in the best fellow in the world. So, this was all very confusing. But then later, Mao Zedong sent the record of this conversation to the Chinese, various party cells to discuss it. And people sent back inquiries saying, why do we call the Americans, since, why do we have such a good impression of them and we still criticize the Soviets? So what strikes me in this episode is how remarkably pragmatic Mao Zedong could be, and how he could cast ideology aside and embrace America in that case for pragmatic security interests in order to oppose the Soviet Union. And I think that pragmatism, I think it still drives Chinese foreign policy in some ways. I do see this alignment with Russia as pragmatic in many ways, but of course there's also common vision and common fear of what you've described as American subversion, color revolutions and things like that. Of course they worry about that. And that also brings them together. And what else could I mention about this? You mentioned Lin Biao. I have to tell you my anecdote about Lin Biao.
Sure.
I don't know if anybody wants to hear my anecdote about Lin Biao, but anyway, Lin Biao is he was once upon a time he was Mao's heir apparent. So everybody thought it was actually the most dangerous place to be a dictator's heir apparent. So evidently his son tried to overthrow Mao Zedong, and then Lin Biao had to flee to the Soviet Union, despite being a very anti-Soviet leader for many years. So he got into this airplane and flew um, to the Soviet Union over Mongolia, and then the airplane crashed, as we know, because it allegedly ran out of fuel. And so when I lived in Mongolia, I was able to get my hands on the crash report, um, which had a GPS coordinates of where it happened. So I thought, let's check it out.
Right there?
I went there. It was such a strange experience. I put it in Google Maps, and see if I could drive there. And so I drove there with Shen Zhihua. I don't know if you know Shen Zhihua. He's a Chinese historian who came and visited me. I said, let's go find where Lin Biao's plane crashed. So we went there looking for the site of Lin Biao's plane crash, which we found. And there was also a grave there. There's an urban legend that the Soviets sent a team. They were so surprised that Lin Biao fled to the Soviet Union. They could not believe that. So they sent KGB to check it out. And they dug up the corpses and took the heads to check out the dental records. And the heads are allegedly in Moscow. So, but we did not check this theory because, it would be too much. But yes, we had it. Anyway, but thank you. Yeah, thank you for your comments.
Very interesting scholarship. Rummaging through the archives. Yeah. There's a little of that there too. Well, let's talk Russia, Mike.
Sergey, first, it's a wonderful book. I've really enjoyed it. I think one of the things I especially appreciate, and again, going on the leadership question, the fact that you are focusing on leadership, you're focusing on personality, worldviews. There's not enough of that in international relations and political science. And there's still, especially among realists, this fixation on the state instead of looking at the leaders. And I was cheering during the part of the book when you were talking about what's the reality. Well, states are led by people. Maybe we should focus on them. And so, bravo. You mentioned NATO in your talk, and it reminded me of a part of the book in which you were talking about how, the Soviet system is falling apart, and Gorbachev is really worried about German reunification and East Germany becoming part of NATO as well. And you commented that had the roles been reversed, you think that Gorbachev would have treated the Americans much the same way that the Americans treated Gorbachev. And I was wondering if you could comment on that a little bit.
Thank you, Mike. Actually, you picked up on this very interesting point in the book, with which I really struggled, because we have this. The Russians complain about this all the time. So, well, the Americans made certain promises. Promises were not kept, and they looked down on us, and they didn't do this, and they didn't do that, and they mistreated us in various ways, which I feel is just so ridiculous in so many ways. Um, the Soviets lost the Cold War, and that's something that Gorbachev was unwilling, it seems, to accept for a time. He was not willing to accept that. He met with Bush in Malta in December 1989, and he was trying to spin the story how actually the Soviet Union did not lose the Cold War, but actually it was the Cold War that lost itself. And you read it, it's just like, that doesn't make any sense. What is he talking about? But the bottom line was that, Gorbachev discovered universal human values, and he took offense when he heard about American values of freedom and democracy. He would say, well, these are not American values, these are our common values, so what are you trying to do here, saying that we're deferring to your values? That's not the case at all, right? So he would try to do that, and part of me just thinks, well, was he just playing? I mean, what, he was just pretending? Or did he really understand what is going on? Because the Soviet Union lost, and he had to accept this reality. And moreover, if it turned out that America was a broken country, and things would fall apart in the United States, and America's European allies would say, "Oh, God save us from America. Let's now, we're asking for admission to the Warsaw Pact." And then the Soviet Union would do the same thing that ultimately happened to Russia, to the Soviet Union and Russia. So a part of me, the more cynical kind of part of me, says, the Soviets got what they deserved, and even probably were treated quite well compared to the way that they would have treated an adversary who was defeated in a prolonged struggle like that. But another part of me, and this is where the problem is for me, which I never was able to resolve for myself. I don't really talk about it in the book, but I've never been able to resolve for myself as I deal with the reality of where we find ourselves today with Putin and Russia's relationship with the West, is that, okay, Russia was humiliated and perhaps deserved it, and anyway, they're responsible for all their mess that they've created, and who made Russia corrupt and who made Russia weak. Of course, they're responsible themselves, and they should not blame the United States or lack of generosity or the fact that there was not another Marshall Plan to rescue them from this predicament. But then a part of me says, well, but this is what led us to where we are to a certain extent. This is what led us to where we are, to this buildup of resentment. And was there an opportunity? Was there a way to somehow avoid it and create a more healthy Russia? And was that chance squandered? I would never blame the United States for it, because I think Russia has the main role here. It's responsible. It's an adult country. It should be responsible for its own fate. But on the other hand, I guess when it took responsibility for itself, that's how we ended up with Putin. Because when Putin came to power, what did he begin his rule with? He promised the Russian people that he will bring Russia up from its knees. And there's this sense of resentment that was in the Russian public. And I remember, the 1990s, you remember that. The 1990s were a terrible time for Russia from so many perspectives. People were basically starving. But it's not just about the economic deprivation. It was more about the humiliation, this loss of your status. But the ambition remained. The Russians always had an ambition that far outpaced their means. But they had this gigantic ambition to be recognized as some kind of great power. And here comes a guy who says, I will make it happen. We have been humiliated. I will make it happen. And here we are. So I guess we got what we bargained for. I think that's all I can say about this.
Well, I agree with you that, the Soviets did lose the Cold War, but I do wonder about the wisdom of the United States treating Russia as a defeated power. And I keep going back to the 1920s and the way Germany was treated as well. And of course, certainly, especially if you're the French, there was going to be a lot of ill will toward Germany. But of course, it was punishing the wrong government, right? And in terms of a post-Soviet Russia, in a sense, it's punishing the wrong government too. And I just, and again, I'm not sure how it could have been different, but on the other hand, I think that I wonder sometimes that had the United States been a little bit more modest in its victory, um, that maybe things could have turned out a little bit differently. But I have one more NATO question for you, and this is something too that I'd not known before, and maybe you're the first person to reveal this, and if you are, please take credit for it. I was fascinated by something that you said that so advice that Anatoly Chernyayev, one of Gorbachev's advisors, was giving to Gorbachev in terms of where is it important that NATO's borders stay put, and well, what if not only East Germany was part of NATO, but say Poland was part of NATO too? Would it really make any difference? And from Chernyaev's perspective, no, it wouldn't make any difference because we have nuclear weapons. No one's going to invade us. And when I read that, I thought, that's pretty darn good theory, because that's right in line with Ken Waltz's argument about nuclear weapons, that if you've got nuclear weapons, you really don't have to worry about being invaded. And as I thought about that, Chernyayev was onto something. But of course, the trick is, how do you convince others that you're right?
Yeah. So thank you, Mike, and that's a really interesting example, and um, we can talk about Waltz, Kenneth Waltz, or we can even argue that Chernayev was a constructivist of a kind, in the IR sense. That is because sort of following Alexander Wendt, you can argue that security is what states make of it, or security is what the officials at the top of the state hierarchy make of it. And you had different types, different people, and they had very different visions of what security was. I think the first Soviet official that really believed that the Soviet Union was safe from an invasion was actually Nikita Khrushchev. He loved nuclear weapons. He just fell in love with nuclear weapons. He has this in his recollections. He describes how he entrusted he asked Igor Kurchatov, who was the scientific head of the Soviet nuclear program, said, well, why don't you write me a report about what happens in the nuclear war? And Kurchatov wrote a report which was very truthful, and Khrushchev read it and was absolutely horrified. And then he asked Kurchatov, is it that bad? And Kurchatov said, well, it's actually much worse. And Khrushchev said, I could not sleep for several days after I read this. But then I realized that I will never have to use those weapons. And I could sleep again. But what he realized too, that the fact that nuclear revolution had happened, that the Soviet Union had the means of delivering also extremely destructive nuclear bombs, which he liked to advertise. You remember the October 30th, 1961 test of the Tsar bomb, 57 megatons, the biggest bomb that was ever tested in the Novaya Zemlya range. That completely wiped it out. It turned into complete, whole mountains were basically wiped out. He liked to do that, but he also felt that this gave the Soviet Union protection. Nobody would dare to invade the Soviet Union, but he could also use that for political gain. And so he engaged in nuclear bluff, and so we saw that from Berlin in 58 to 61, the Cuban Missile Crisis. By the way, Putin totally is on the same page when it comes to that. He understands that this is where Russia has considerable advantage. He can use that nuclear card. He understands that nobody wants to fight a nuclear war with Russia over Ukraine. Nobody wants to do that. And he has played it very skillfully. Does he really think that NATO is a threat to Russia? That is an interesting question, because you could actually make this argument, and Putin is not the only one, and Chernayev was not the only one. Back in 1990, when those discussions about Germany were taking place, there were also military people around Gorbachev who were saying, no, of course NATO is a threat, because that's what they were taught to believe, and they think in terms of conventional war, for example. So, they would think, okay, yeah, we have nuclear weapons, but let's say the Americans have invaded us conventionally, and are we going to use nuclear weapons against that, or is there credibility in this, etc.? So you can make this argument, and so projecting forward to where we find ourselves today, when people say, by the way, when people say, here's the one reason why Putin invaded Ukraine, I always just think, come on, who has a Wi-Fi connection to Putin's brain here? I certainly don't. I don't think any of those explanations make any sense. But, they do make sense, but I think it's much better to take a more nuanced view on what happened, and I think his security perceptions with regard to NATO probably played a certain role, but also his maybe imperialist visions, the idea of having Ukraine as part of Russia. But fundamentally, and this is where it becomes interesting, fundamentally, I think he wanted to teach Ukraine a lesson, and not just Ukraine, but other countries around Russia, that, to quote unquote, show them their place. I was struck a few months ago, there was a press conference that Putin had, and Steve Rosenberg, who's BBC editor in Moscow, some of you may know him, is a good friend of mine, but anyway, he asked Putin, he said, so are you happy now that is Russia more secure now that you've invaded Ukraine? And this is the time where Russia is being bombed by drones, and Putin says, instead of saying, oh yeah, it was all about NATO, and instead of launching into some kind of discussion about NATO, he did not even go there. He said something very interesting. He said, they, meaning the West, were trying to show us our place. And by invading Ukraine, we show that we're not going to take that. But what they're doing by invading Ukraine is precisely to try to show Ukraine their place. This is a very strange kind of mentality. There's a very hierarchical mentality where the Russians feel that, like they have the special role, special sphere of influence, and they are entitled to tell Ukrainians how to behave, the Georgians, maybe the Baltic states, certainly not the United States, because this is another big power, and certainly not China, because that's another big power. And so you can have a back and forth with those countries. And by the way, Susan, I forgot to address your question about unlimited partnership, or the so-called partnership without limits, which, by the way, as you would agree with me on this, was actually Chinese concept. The Chinese tried to introduce that term. The Chinese tried to introduce, and then they dropped it after 2022, so you never find it again. Now the only people who used that were the State Department in the United States. Tony Blinken made a speech at SAIS where he talked about unlimited partnership, and I later asked somebody who was sort of working with him. I said, "Do you guys realize that the Chinese no longer use this term, partnership without limits?" And I was like, oh, really? But I think it actually concealed. I think it actually concealed the strategy, because I think part of the American strategy was to try to get the Chinese to own this relationship with Russia. Maybe, I don't know. I don't know why they kept using that in one document, but not later.
Okay, but it's a rather important document.
It is an important document, but later they issued many other important documents in various joint statements. You'll never find it there.
If you can have your microphone, that'd be great.
They want to duck it because I think Putin kind of suckered Xi Jinping into that statement.
And so the Chinese don't want it. I think the Chinese
That's,
were the ones who put it in.
Of course they don't want it.
And then they dropped it. And I had the same experience, by the way, in Beijing just recently, where I was having conversations with Chinese counterparts about the issue of this relationship with Russia, and they were so desperate to claim that they were not in alliance. There was not an alliance with the Russians, etc. They were very, very desperate to show us, like, well, we have not, no, of course we don't want to throw them under the bus, but we're not in alliance.
Well, I think that is very controversial within China, and it didn't win Xi Jinping a lot of points from a lot of people in China. So,
okay, let's get the audience involved here. Mr. Matthews, right? No, Clay. No, Matt. There we go. Clay. Yeah, Clay. That's right.
So I have a question for Dr. Radchenko. So you talked earlier about how this new Russian approach and the U.S. government might be a reverse Nixon strategy. Thank you. Might be a reverse Nixon strategy and a strategy to kind of drive apart Russia and China. Um, in my view, and in the view of a lot of other scholars of political science, there's a lot of leadership similarities between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, both in terms of uh, trying to garner up political support, like you mentioned earlier. Kind of part of Putin's campaigning strategy is this idea that Russia needs to be pulled up from his knees. This is the same type of rhetoric we've seen used by Donald Trump, or both of the leaders, kind of masculine machizo domination vision and image they try to portray, and then even their stances of the executive vis-a-vis institutions in a government. So there's similarities between these leaders, and I wanted to ask you if you see this new U.S.-Russia partnership or this new relationship that's trying to be forged by the Trump administration as uh, as having as being an effect of those leadership similarities or personal affinities between two leaders that many political science scholars would identify both as personalist authoritarians, and whether that plays as much or whether that plays a role or if there's simply this kind of international relations strategy vis-a-vis China.
Anybody who wants to grab
Yeah.
that one.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to grab this one. I think the key issue to me, the key issue to understand about Putin-Trump relation is clearly that they have certainly Trump has a degree of respect for Putin that is very uncharacteristic of any American leader. But there's something else to this, and I think there's something like a shared vision of the world, or similarity, certainly an overlapping vision of the world. Uh, and just to show what I mean, I want to contrast this with two other moments in history very briefly. In 1945, you have the Yalta Conference, right? So there's a prospect of great power cooperation post Second World War. Stalin thinks that the Americans will get out of Europe. He thinks that they'll go back, but he gets it wrong. The Americans stay in Europe. Stalin thought about the world in 19th century terms. You could divvy it up into spheres of influence, and anything that was next to the Soviet Union was basically a Soviet sphere by default. For example, he would impose a government on Bulgaria and Romania, a communist government. He thought, of course, he had the right to do so because they were next to him. But when the Americans, Harry S. Truman, in fact, raised noise about it, saying, well, we're not going to recognize those governments. They're not democratic. Stalin was like, what do you have to do with Romania and Bulgaria? Look at where America is and where Romania and Bulgaria is, where this is not. But so there was a clash of visions. There was an American vision of an open world, and there was a Soviet vision of a 19th century division of the world into spheres of influence. So this is one moment where I think that also contributed to the outbreak of the Cold War. I think the same thing happened, and I touched on that in my remarks in the early 1970s. Why Detente failed? I think there was this strategic competition. They saw themselves as two great powers, and despite all the friendship, it didn't quite work out because there was a temptation to basically stab each other in the back in various theaters, whether it is in Africa or Latin America or the Middle East. And they did. They stabbed each other in the back the moment they got a chance to. So this condominium did not work out. But consider where we are today. We have an American president whose vision is similar in weird respects, similar to this 19th century vision of division of the world into spheres of influence. We also have Russia that is not really a global competitor to the United States. I mean, it's not in the same league. It's not like the Soviet Union. It's not a peer competitor as much as it may want to be. It's basically a regional power. Also, it does not have an ideology that contradicts anything that Trump says. Basically, they seem to be aligned in many ways. So it is, in this sense, you have an alignment of visions, a certain alignment of values, and a very different power relationship between these two countries, which make Russia seemingly less threatening to Trump than certainly to European countries that have that worry about it greatly. So that's where we find ourselves today. I think that is what is driving this strange rapprochement. Whether or not it will happen or not, we're still to see. But I think President Trump is certainly working hard to make it happen.
Mike, I'm going to give you the last word on this. Do you have something you'd like?
I think Putin reminds me of a college roommate of mine. Um, Not in the way you think. At Ohio State. And by the way, just for the record, I always thought the Ohio State University was really stupid. But anyway, I just never bought into it. I just thought it was odd. Um, and anyway, this college roommate, he liked to date more than one woman at once and without telling either of them that he was doing it.
This
And-
doesn't sound like it's going in the right direction.
But my point is that I think Putin is kind of like that these relationships between Russia and China, between Russia and the United States, from Putin's perspective, my own sense is these are relationships of convenience, and he'll get what he can from either as much as he's able, but when the one or the other is not really convenient, he'll throw them over. And so I'm not. And so, I don't know, just the idea of prying China and Russia apart, from what I do know about China, in its foreign policy, very independent, right? Wanting to maintain its independence, not wanting to be tied to any, strong long-term commitments. And, Putin, when you think about spheres of influence, Putin is clearly the junior partner. The United States and the China are in the driver's seat, and if the United States and China are both driving motorcycles with sidecars, Putin has to decide which sidecar he wants to be in at which time. But I don't see a long-term solution for Russia with that. I mean, as it has continuing declining population and economy that continues to struggle. I don't see how he pulls it off.
We're going to have to leave it there, folks. Sorry. But tomorrow you have more opportunities to visit with these scholars. If you're in the Furman community, which is defined very broadly, you are welcome to the politics department in Johns Hall at 12:30 for Tacos in Tocqueville, which is free tacos and visiting with our scholars. We get together, we have an informal discussion. And then tomorrow at 5 p.m. in Burgess, which is the theater down there, we will hear from Susan Shirk on China and again reassemble a panel and enjoy more talk about America's role in the world as well as Russia and China. So let's give our panelists a hand. And you are dismissed.